Good day. Today, we embark on a historical journey that would reshape the medieval world, pit civilizations against each other, and leave scars that persist to this very day. We're talking about the Crusades, a series of military campaigns that began in 1095 and continued for nearly 2 centuries. These were not simple wars. They were complex movements driven by religion, politics, economics, and human ambition. The Crusades represent one of the most consequential events in European history. They fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Mediterranean, changed the course of Christian and Islamic relations, and set in motion economic and cultural forces that would eventually lead to the European Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. But what exactly were the Crusades? They were military expeditions launched by the papacy and Western European Christian rulers against Muslim forces, primarily aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem and the Holy Land. The term crusade comes from the Latin word crux, meaning cross, referring to the cross that crusaders wore on their garments as they marched toward the east. The story of the Crusades is not simply one of religious fervor, though that played an undeniable role. It is a tale of ambitious popes seeking to extend their power, knights seeking glory and fortune, merchants seeking profit, and common people seeking salvation. It is a story of triumphs and disasters, of incredible courage and shocking brutality, of cultural exchange and religious intolerance. Over the next 40 minutes, we will explore the major crusades, the key figures who drove these movements, the battles that defined them, and the lasting consequences that would reverberate through the centuries. Let us begin. To understand the Crusades, we must first understand the world in which they emerged. By the end of the 11th century, Christian Europe and the Islamic world had been in contact for over 4 centuries. In 632, just after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Islamic armies had conquered vast territories, including the wealthy provinces of the Byzantine Empire, Egypt, North Africa, Syria, and Palestine. These were Christian lands. For 400 years, Christians in the East had lived under Islamic rule, though the relationship was complex. Some Christians were persecuted, others were tolerated under a system called the dhimmi system, which allowed Christians and Jews to practice their faith while paying special taxes. Pilgrimage to Christian holy sites, particularly Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, believed to be the site of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, continued, though sometimes with difficulty. By 1095, the geopolitical map had changed dramatically. The Byzantine Empire, which had survived the Islamic conquests and ruled Constantinople and much of the Balkans, was in crisis. Turkish invaders, the Seljuk Turks, had defeated the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. This defeat shattered Byzantine military power and threatened Constantinople itself. Desperate, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos reached out to the West for military assistance. He sent ambassadors to Pope Urban II, appealing for military aid against the Turkish threat. The Pope saw an extraordinary opportunity. Here was a chance to strengthen his authority in the Christian world, to reunite the Eastern and Western churches, which had been split since 1054 over theological and liturgical disputes, and to restore Christian control of the Holy Land. The Pope also tapped into deeper currents of religious sentiment in Western Europe. Christian pilgrims returning from the Holy Land reported instances of harassment and mistreatment. While the overall situation was more nuanced than these reports suggested, the Pope used them to stir religious passion. He preached that the sacred places of Christianity, the tomb of Christ, the city of Jerusalem, were being desecrated by infidels. Additionally, Europe itself was experiencing change. The feudal system was stabilizing, but this stability meant there was a surplus of younger sons of nobles, men trained in warfare but without lands or prospects. The Church saw in the Crusades an opportunity to channel this warrior energy toward a sacred purpose rather than toward internal European conflicts. Urban II offered something extraordinary: indulgence. The Church taught that through crusade, warriors could receive forgiveness for their sins and earn a place in heaven. For medieval Christians, this was an incredibly powerful motivation. A crusade was not merely a military campaign, it was understood as a pilgrimage, a sacred journey undertaken for spiritual salvation. The combination of religious fervor, political opportunity, and the promise of material gain created a potent force. The Pope had his answer to the Byzantine Emperor's plea. On November 27, 1095, Pope Urban II stood before the Council of Clermont in France and delivered one of the most consequential speeches in history. The exact words have not survived, but chroniclers report that the Pope called on the faithful to take up arms to aid their brothers in Constantinople and to liberate the Holy Land. He promised spiritual rewards beyond measure. Those who died in this holy cause would be martyrs, those who survived would return with souls cleansed of sin. The response was extraordinary. The Pope embarked on a preaching tour throughout France, and his message spread across Europe through letters, embassies, and word of mouth. Major churches became recruitment centers. By 1096, armies were forming, and warriors from across Europe, France, Germany, Italy, and beyond, began the long journey toward Constantinople and the Holy Land. But before the official church-organized crusade, something unexpected happened. Thousands of common people, peasants, craftsmen, pilgrims, set out for Jerusalem. This movement, known as the People's Crusade or the Peasants' Crusade, was largely led by an itinerant preacher named Peter the Hermit and a nobleman named Walter Sans Avoir. The participants were often poorly equipped and untrained. These masses of pilgrims traveled overland through Europe, heading toward Constantinople. However, their passage caused problems. In the Rhineland, anti-Jewish violence erupted as crusaders attacked Jewish communities, blaming them for the crucifixion of Christ. Thousands of Jews were murdered. The People's Crusade ultimately ended in disaster. As the Crusaders entered Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks attacked them at the Battle of Civitate in 1096. The Crusaders were slaughtered. The few survivors retreated to Constantinople. The official Crusades, led by princes and nobles, what became known as the Princes' Crusade, were far better organized and equipped. By June 1097, approximately 40,000 Crusaders had assembled at Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Alexios, suspicious of these Western warriors, required them to swear oaths not to keep conquered territory for themselves but to return it to Byzantine control. The Crusaders then crossed into Anatolia and marched southward toward Syria. This was a grueling journey. Supplies were scarce, disease was rampant, and the heat was devastating. Yet the Crusaders persevered. In October 1097, the Crusaders reached the great city of Antioch and began a months-long siege. It was during this siege that one of the Crusaders' leaders, Baldwin of Boulogne, left with a small force, seized the city of Edessa with local Armenian support, and established the First Crusader state, the county of Edessa, in March 1098. The siege of Antioch lasted 7 months. The city was heavily fortified and the Crusaders faced starvation and disease. At one point, the situation was so dire that some Crusaders advocated abandoning the campaign. But then came what the Crusaders interpreted as a miracle. A monk reported that he had found the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced Jesus' side during the crucifixion, buried beneath the city's church of St. Peter. Whether this was authentic or a pious fraud remains debated by historians, but for the Crusaders, it was a powerful spiritual sign. Their morale renewed, they launched a desperate assault and broke into the city. From Antioch, the Crusaders continued southward in 1099. They captured several cities and towns, slowly working their way toward their ultimate goal, Jerusalem. The journey was long and difficult, but by June 1099, the Crusaders had reached the Holy City. On July 15, 1099, the Crusaders breached the walls of Jerusalem and poured into the city. What followed was a massacre of horrifying proportions. Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were slaughtered in enormous numbers. The Crusaders, believing they were carrying out God's will, waded through the streets killing indiscriminately. Contemporary chronicles claim that blood ran through the streets, though some modern historians believe this was exaggerated. Nevertheless, thousands died. Once the violence subsided, the Crusaders established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, with Godfrey of Bouillon as its ruler. They also established other Crusader states, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the County of Edessa. These four states would form the basis of Crusader presence in the Levant for nearly 2 centuries. The First Crusade was, by the standards of the time, a stunning military success. Against considerable odds, a Western European force had conquered and held territory in the eastern Mediterranean. The Crusaders had achieved what seemed impossible, the recapture of Jerusalem for Christendom. But this triumph came at a cost. The massacre at Jerusalem shocked even some medieval observers. The Crusaders' brutality alienated the local Christian populations, who were dismayed by the violence perpetrated against fellow Christians who had coexisted with Muslims for centuries. And the establishment of Crusader rule created a new frontier in the medieval world, a line of contested territory that would remain unstable for nearly 200 years. For nearly 50 years, the Crusader states held their own. But in 1144, the Muslim leader Nur ad-Din captured the county of Edessa, the oldest and northernmost of the Crusader states. This was a shock to Christian Europe. If the Crusader states could lose territory, perhaps the gains of the First Crusade were not permanent. In response, Pope Eugenius III called for a Second Crusade in 1147. This time, the crusade was led by the crowned kings of Europe themselves, King Louis VII of France and the German Emperor Conrad III. These were not just warriors, they were Europe's most powerful monarchs. The Second Crusade was thus a far more ambitious affair than the first. Yet it was an utter failure. The two European armies marched separately to Constantinople and then into Anatolia. The Seljuk Turks ambushed them and defeated them decisively at the Battle of Dorylaeum in 1147. Both armies suffered catastrophic losses. The Crusaders, demoralized and depleted, continued to the Holy Land, but they were no longer a serious military force. The campaign ended without accomplishing any of its objectives. Antioch and the remaining Crusader states faced increasing pressure from Muslim forces. The decades following the Second Crusade saw the gradual consolidation of Muslim power under a remarkable military leader named Saladin. Born in Mesopotamia in 1137, Saladin rose through the ranks of the Zengid dynasty to become the Sultan of Egypt and Syria by 1174. Saladin was not only a formidable military commander but also a charismatic leader who united the fragmented Muslim powers of the Levant under his rule. Saladin's strategy was methodical and relentless. He gradually conquered Crusader-held territories, picking them off one by one. The Crusader states, divided by internal conflicts and weakened by decades of struggle, could not mount an effective unified defense. In 1187, Saladin moved for the prize, Jerusalem itself. The Crusaders, led by King Guy of Lusignan, assembled their forces to meet him. On July 4, 1187, at a location known as the Horns of Hattin, the two armies met. Saladin's forces surrounded the Crusaders and inflicted a devastating defeat. The Crusaders' king was captured, and their great sacred relic, the True Cross, which had been carried by the Crusader army since the First Crusade, fell into Saladin's hands. After Hattin, the Crusader kingdoms collapsed. City after city fell to Saladin's advancing forces. By October 1187, Saladin stood before the walls of Jerusalem itself. The city, now poorly defended, surrendered. The Holy City, conquered by Crusaders nearly a century earlier, was once again in Muslim hands. The news of Jerusalem's fall shocked Christian Europe. Pope Gregory VIII called for a new crusade, and this time, the response was led by three of the mightiest rulers of the West: Richard I of England, known as Richard the Lionheart, Philip II Augustus of France, and the German Emperor Frederick I Barbarossa. The Third Crusade, also known as the King's Crusade, was the largest and most expensive crusade yet mounted. Frederick Barbarossa led a massive army through Byzantine territory. He was an elderly man, and the grueling journey through Anatolia proved too much. He died in 1190, and his army effectively disbanded. Richard and Philip took a different route, sailing from Italy to the Holy Land. During the voyage, Richard's army captured the island of Cyprus from Greek rulers, providing a valuable base for future crusading efforts. Once in the Holy Land, Richard proved to be a formidable military commander. He won a series of victories, most notably defeating Saladin at the Battle of Arsuf in September 1191. The Crusaders captured the vital port city of Acre after a lengthy siege that lasted from 1191 to 1192. However, Philip returned to France after the fall of Acre, leaving Richard with fewer forces. Despite Richard's victories, he could not achieve the ultimate goal, the recapture of Jerusalem. Saladin's armies remained formidable, and both Richard and Saladin were exhausted by years of warfare and their coffers were depleted. Moreover, both leaders were aging and in declining health. In September 1192, Richard and Saladin negotiated a truce. The Crusaders agreed to maintain control of the coastal cities they had conquered, particularly Acre and Jaffa, while Saladin retained control of Jerusalem. Importantly, the treaty allowed Christian pilgrims to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem. While not a complete victory for the Crusaders, the treaty at least secured a measure of Western Christian access to their holiest sites. Richard departed for Europe, and thus the Third Crusade concluded. While the Crusaders had won significant battles and seized important cities, they had failed in their primary objective, to recapture and retain Jerusalem. The psychological impact was significant. It was becoming clear to Europeans that the crusading venture might not be indefinitely sustainable. In 1202, Pope Innocent III called for a Fourth Crusade with the ambitious goal of striking at Saladin's power base in Egypt before attempting to retake the Holy Land. The Crusader leaders met with Venetian merchants to arrange transport. Venice, a maritime republic, had the greatest fleet in Christendom. However, a critical problem emerged: the Crusaders could not raise enough money to pay for the transport. Venice, a pragmatic merchant republic, offered a solution. The Crusaders could defer payment if they first helped Venice capture the Christian city of Zara in modern-day Croatia, a rival trading port. Desperate for transport, the Crusaders agreed. The sack of Zara was a shocking development, Crusaders attacking a Christian city. The Pope was furious and excommunicated the Crusaders, though he later lifted the excommunication. But worse was to come. After Zara, a Byzantine prince, Alexios Angelos, approached the Crusader leadership with a proposition. His father, the Emperor Isaac II, had been deposed by his brother Alexios III. The prince promised the Crusaders an enormous sum of money and military support if they would help him restore his father to the throne. The Crusaders agreed. In June 1203, the Crusader fleet sailed to Constantinople, the greatest Christian city in the world. They breached the walls and restored Isaac II and his son Alexios IV to power. But then a disaster unfolded. The new emperor could not raise the promised payments. Moreover, the Crusaders were pillaging the city, alienating the populace. The situation deteriorated until a faction of the Byzantine nobility, led by a nobleman named Alexios Doukas, staged a counter-coup. Isaac II was deposed again, and Alexios IV was deposed and murdered. Furious at being cheated and having their leader killed, the Crusaders responded with unprecedented brutality. In April 1204, they launched an all-out assault on Constantinople. For 3 days, they ravaged the city. They looted the imperial palaces, desecrated the great Hagia Sophia Cathedral, and carried off priceless religious relics and works of art. So much treasure was stolen that contemporaries reported that 2/3 of the wealth of the world was in Constantinople, and now that wealth was being distributed to France and Venice. The Crusaders then established the Latin Empire, placing one of their own, Baldwin of Flanders, on the Byzantine throne. The Byzantine Empire was reduced to a small rump state, and Constantinople remained under Latin rule for nearly 60 years until the Byzantines reconquered it in 1261. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was a catastrophic turning point in history. It was the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire. The Fourth Crusade had become a crusade against Christians rather than against Muslims. The schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, already deep, became irreparable. And Western Christendom was no longer united behind the crusading ideal as it had been at the beginning. The 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Crusades of the 13th century were generally more limited in scope and far less successful than the earlier Crusades. The 5th Crusade attempted to strike at Egypt but was repelled. The 6th Crusade, led by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, achieved a diplomatic success. Frederick negotiated the temporary return of Jerusalem to Christian control without a major battle, though the crusade was controversial because Frederick had been excommunicated. The 7th Crusade was led by the devout French King Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis. Despite initial successes in capturing Egyptian ports, the crusade ultimately failed, and Louis was captured. He was ransomed, and the crusade was abandoned. The 8th Crusade, also led by Louis IX in his last years, was even more disastrous. Louis died of dysentery shortly after arriving in Tunis, having accomplished nothing. Throughout the 13th century, the Crusader states slowly contracted as Muslim forces, particularly under leaders like the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, gradually conquered Crusader-held territories. Jerusalem was lost again in 1244. One by one, Crusader cities fell. By 1291, only one major Crusader stronghold remained, the port city of Acre. The Mamluk Sultan al-Ashraf laid siege to the city. The Crusaders mounted a determined defense, but they were vastly outnumbered. By May 18, 1291, the city had fallen. The last survivors, members of the military orders, particularly the Templars, fled by sea. With the fall of Acre, nearly 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Levant came to an end. Subsequent popes called for new crusades, but no major organized crusade to the Holy Land would ever be successfully launched again. The crusading age was over. While the great kings and nobles organized major crusades, there were also smaller, more spontaneous crusading movements that reveal much about the religious fervor of the medieval period. Chief among these was the People's Crusade in 1096, which preceded the official First Crusade. As mentioned earlier, after Pope Urban II's call, thousands of common people, peasants, laborers, women, and children, set out for Jerusalem without waiting for organized leadership or armies. They were led by charismatic preachers, most notably an itinerant monk called Peter the Hermit. These crusaders traveled overland through Europe. However, lacking organization and supplies, they suffered terribly. In the Rhineland, violence erupted against Jewish communities. Many Jews were slaughtered as crusaders blamed them for the death of Christ and seized the opportunity to plunder their wealth. The massacres were so severe that they are recorded in Jewish chronicles as among the worst persecutions of the medieval period. The People's Crusade reached Constantinople but was unprepared to face organized Turkish armies. When they entered Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks attacked them at Civitate, and most of the crusaders were killed. Some survivors regrouped with the main crusader armies and participated in the later successes of the First Crusade, but the People's Crusade itself was a catastrophe. An even more poignant episode occurred in 1212 with what became known as the Children's Crusade. However, historians debate whether this was truly a crusade of children or a crusade of the poor that included children and was led by young leaders. In France, a charismatic figure named Stephen of Cloyes, said to be around 12 years old, claimed he had been called by Jesus to lead a crusade to recover the Holy Cross that had been lost to Saladin at the Battle of Hattin. Stephen gathered thousands of followers and marched to Paris, seeking the blessing of King Philip II. Accounts suggest that tens of thousands of people, mostly children but including many adults, joined Stephen's movement. From France, Stephen's followers marched southward toward the Mediterranean, hoping to cross to the Holy Land. They reached the port of Marseille, but without transport, many simply dispersed or were sold into slavery by unscrupulous merchants. In Germany, a similar movement was led by a boy named Nicholas of Cologne. His followers also intended to reach the Holy Land. Nicholas believed that the sea would miraculously part for them, just as it had for Moses. These German crusaders struggled over the Alps, losing many members to cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Those who reached Genoa in Italy found no passage to the Holy Land and dispersed. The Children's Crusade, whatever its exact nature, ended in failure and tragedy. Few, if any, of those who set out reached the Holy Land. Many died en route, others were enslaved or lost to history. The episode represents the depth of crusading fervor among ordinary people and the willingness of medieval society to sacrifice even its youngest members for what was perceived as a sacred cause. A crucial element of the Crusades that deserves particular attention is the rise of the military religious orders, organizations that combined monastic life with military power. The two most important of these were the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller. The Knights Templar arose in the 1120s, originally established to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. They were founded by French knights and received papal approval in 1129. The Templars took monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but unlike ordinary monks, they were warriors. They wore white mantles emblazoned with a red cross and were bound to fight for Christianity. Over time, the Templars became fabulously wealthy, acquiring extensive lands in Europe and the Middle East. They also became the medieval world's closest equivalent to bankers, holding the deposits of wealthy pilgrims and merchants and issuing letters of credit. The Knights Hospitaller began as an organization running a hospital in Jerusalem to care for sick pilgrims. Like the Templars, they gradually militarized and became formidable warriors. The Hospitallers were eventually based in Rhodes and later in Malta, from where they continued to fight against Muslim powers well into the early modern period. A third military order, less well known today but important at the time, was the Teutonic Knights, founded by German crusaders in 1190. The Teutonic Knights eventually shifted their focus from the Levant to the Baltic region, where they conquered and Christianized pagan territories. The military orders were crucial to the crusading movement. They provided professional soldiers, military expertise, and fortified strongholds that held the Crusader states together. They were among the last defenders of Crusader cities when they fell. When Acre was besieged in 1291, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights were among the last to surrender, dying heroically in defense of the city. However, the military orders also became increasingly wealthy and politically powerful, sometimes acting independently of the papacy and the local Crusader lords. Their wealth and power would eventually lead to their downfall. The Templars, in particular, were suppressed in the early 14th century by King Philip IV of France, who coveted their immense wealth. The Crusades had profound consequences for both Christianity and Islam, for Europe and the Middle East. Religiously, the Crusades deepened the divide between Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Western Catholic Christianity. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was a watershed moment. Eastern Christians never forgot that their greatest city was sacked by Western Crusaders, Christians attacking Christians. The schism that had begun in 1054 became permanent and irreparable. The Crusades also shaped Christian-Muslim relations for centuries. In the Islamic world, the Crusades were understood as invasions and wars of conquest. The Crusades became a defining moment in Islamic historical consciousness, a symbol of conflict between Christian and Islamic civilization. This memory would be invoked for centuries whenever Christian powers seemed threatening to Muslim lands. Politically, the Crusades strengthened the papacy. The Pope had led the great religious mobilization of Christendom. His authority was enhanced. However, as crusading failed and the Church became associated with warfare and violence, the Pope's moral authority eventually suffered. The spectacle of crusaders sacking Constantinople, massacring Jews, and enriching themselves through holy war undermined the spiritual ideal the Crusades were supposed to represent. Economically, the Crusades had significant effects. The need to transport vast armies across Europe and the Mediterranean spurred development of merchant fleets, particularly in Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Amalfi. These merchant republics became enormously wealthy by transporting crusaders and their supplies, and by establishing trading posts in crusader-held ports. The increased contact between Europe and the eastern Mediterranean stimulated trade. European merchants became familiar with Eastern goods, silks, spices, perfumes, and luxury items. The demand for these goods grew, spurring long-distance trade networks that would later expand during the Age of Exploration. The movement of soldiers and merchants also facilitated the transfer of knowledge and technology. Europeans learned about Eastern technology, including advanced engineering techniques, agricultural methods, and military innovations. Islamic scholars had preserved Greek and Roman learning, and contact with the Islamic world reintroduced this classical knowledge to Europe, contributing to the intellectual revival of the Renaissance. The Crusades also had significant social effects within Europe. For many younger sons of nobles, the Crusades offered an opportunity for military glory and land acquisition that would not have been available to them in Europe. The conquest of Crusader states created new feudal hierarchies and opportunities for advancement. The need to provision and transport Crusader armies stimulated growth in European cities. Venice, Genoa, and other Mediterranean ports expanded dramatically. The movement of people and goods across vast distances helped break down the relative isolation of feudal Europe and contributed to increased urbanization and the growth of merchant classes. Despite the violence and religious conflict, the Crusades facilitated significant cultural exchange between Europe and the Islamic world. Europeans gained access to Islamic scientific and mathematical knowledge. Islamic scholars had preserved and translated works of ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle, and these works now became available to European scholars, profoundly influencing European intellectual development. From the Islamic world, Europeans learned mathematics, including algebra and Arabic numerals, the numerical system used today. They learned advances in astronomy, geometry, and medicine. They also learned new agricultural techniques and were introduced to new crops, including sugar cane and cotton. European crusaders adopted Islamic-style fortifications and improved siege warfare technology through contact with sophisticated Islamic military techniques. This cultural exchange flowed both ways. Muslims also learned from European military tactics and administrative practices. Over time, Crusaders who remained in the Levant for extended periods adopted aspects of local culture, including clothing, food, and, sometimes, even religious practices. Intermarriage occurred between Crusaders and local Christians, producing a new hybrid population called the Polanes, children of mixed descent who were at home in both European and Eastern cultures. The Crusades also had substantial environmental and demographic impacts. The massive movement of armies through territories caused destruction and disruption of populations. Entire regions were depopulated by warfare, disease, and famine. In the Levant, the constant warfare disrupted agricultural production and trade, leading to periodic famines and economic crises. The passage of Crusader armies through Byzantine territory and the Balkans caused lasting damage to those regions, contributing to the decline of the Byzantine Empire and the destabilization of the Balkans, with consequences that would persist for centuries. Perhaps most significantly, the Crusades contributed to the centralization of European monarchies. The great nobles who financed crusades often lost wealth and sometimes lost sons in the campaigns. Their relative power declined as the power of kings increased. The money spent on crusades was channeled through royal treasuries, strengthening royal institutions. By the 13th century, European monarchies were significantly more powerful and centralized than they had been in the 11th century, in part due to the resources required to finance crusades. Moreover, the failure of later crusades and the increasing costs contributed to shifts in how medieval society understood authority and power. The unlimited military ambitions of the Church became increasingly questioned. The age of unquestioned papal authority in temporal matters was waning, contributing eventually to the crises of the Church in the 14th and 15th centuries, including the Avignon papacy and the Western Schism. While the Crusades in the Levant were failing in the 13th century, the crusading ideal was being extended to other regions. The papacy authorized crusades against pagan peoples in northern Europe, particularly in the Baltic region and against the Wends, a West Slavic people. The Northern Crusades, also called the Baltic Crusades, began in the early 12th century but were formalized when Pope Eugenius III extended the concept of crusading to the Baltic region in the mid-12th century. These crusades aimed to convert pagan peoples to Christianity and to expand Latin Christian territory northward. The Teutonic Knights, after their initial involvement in the Holy Land, refocused their efforts on the Baltic. Beginning in the 13th century, the Teutonic Knights conquered and Christianized large territories in what is now Lithuania, Latvia, and Prussia. Over time, the Teutonic Knights transformed the Baltic from a region of paganism into a Latin Christian area. These northern crusades were somewhat more successful than those in the Levant, in the sense that they achieved permanent territorial conquests and Christianization of pagan peoples. However, they were also marked by considerable brutality and by the desire of the Teutonic Knights to establish their own independent state, more than by purely religious motivations. The papacy also authorized crusades against Christian heretics within Europe itself. Most notably, the Albigensian Crusade was launched against the Cathars, a Christian heterodox sect in southern France that the Church considered heretical. This crusade resulted in the near destruction of Cathar communities and the subordination of southern French territories to northern French control. The extension of crusading to other regions and against other enemies, not just Muslims in the Levant, but pagans in the Baltic and heretics in Europe, demonstrates how the crusading ideal became institutionalized as a tool of church and royal power, extending beyond the original goal of liberating the Holy Land. After the fall of Acre in 1291, the age of great organized crusades to the Holy Land effectively ended. However, the concept of crusading did not disappear immediately. Subsequent popes called for crusades well into the 15th century, but they were rarely large-scale or successful. Some European rulers, particularly in the Mediterranean, continued to fight against Muslim powers and to conduct campaigns that were framed in crusading rhetoric. The Portuguese, for example, conducted wars against Muslim North Africa that were cast as crusades. The Spanish Christian kingdoms continued their own crusade, the Reconquista, against Muslim Granada in southern Spain, a campaign that lasted until 1492. However, by the 14th and 15th centuries, the crusading ideal had lost much of its appeal. The Church's moral authority had been damaged by crusades that turned against Christian cities like Constantinople and by crusades against Christian heretics. Moreover, the rise of nationalism meant that European rulers were less inclined to mobilize their resources for papally organized ventures. Rulers were increasingly focused on expanding their own territorial states rather than on distant crusades to the Holy Land. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 prompted calls for new crusades, and several small crusading expeditions were mounted in the 15th and 16th centuries. However, these were never able to effectively challenge Ottoman power. By the 16th century, the age of crusading had clearly passed. As we reflect on our journey through the nearly 2 centuries of crusading, we must ask, why do the Crusades matter? Why should they be studied? What is their historical significance? First, the Crusades were transformative events in medieval history. They mobilized unprecedented numbers of people, resources, and will across Christendom. They involved European society at every level, from popes and kings to peasants and children, in a vast common enterprise. The crusading ideal, for better or worse, became central to how medieval Europeans understood their identity and their relationship to non-Christian peoples. Second, the Crusades shaped the course of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern history. They established Christian states in the Levant that survived for nearly 2 centuries. They stimulated trade networks that connected Europe and the East. They facilitated cultural and technological exchanges that would eventually contribute to the European Renaissance and the scientific revolution. Third, the Crusades demonstrated both the power and the limitations of religious motivation in history. Religious belief was a powerful force that could mobilize populations and inspire extraordinary sacrifices. Yet the Crusades also revealed that religious motivation could be used to justify violence, conquest, and intolerance. The complexity of crusading, partly religious pilgrimage, partly economic opportunity, partly political conquest, mirrors the complexity of human motivation in history itself. Fourth, the Crusades had lasting consequences for relations between Europe and the Islamic world, and between Eastern and Western Christianity. The memory of the Crusades became embedded in Islamic historical consciousness as a period of Christian invasion and conquest. This historical memory would influence Islamic responses to Western imperialism in later centuries. And the sack of Constantinople in 1204 made the split between Eastern and Western Christianity permanent and irreparable, with consequences that persist to this day. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked not just the end of Crusader presence in the Levant, but also the end of an era. The medieval dream of recovering the Holy Land for Christendom proved unsustainable. The Crusades had failed in their ultimate objective, despite occasional successes. But failure, historically speaking, did not diminish the Crusades' importance. Rather, the Crusades stand as evidence of the enormous ambitions, the deep beliefs, and the capacity for both greatness and brutality that medieval European civilization possessed. As the Crusades are viewed across nearly 1,000 years, both their achievements and their tragedies can be seen. The Crusaders were capable of extraordinary feats of organization, courage, and perseverance. They were also capable of terrible violence, intolerance, and cruelty. The Crusades show that historical events are never purely good or purely evil, purely religious or purely political. They are complex phenomena driven by multiple motivations and producing multiple consequences. They reveal the power of shared belief to motivate collective action, but also the dangers of absolute conviction and religious certainty. For the medieval world, the Crusades were world historical events. They shaped empires, altered religious geography, catalyzed economic development, and facilitated cultural exchange. They were celebrated by supporters as holy warfare and condemned by critics as unjust conquest. They became part of the grand narrative of medieval history. Today, as ongoing tensions between different civilizations and religions continue, the history of the Crusades offers lessons. It reminds that conflicts between religious and cultural civilizations are ancient and deep-rooted. It shows that good intentions and sincere belief can coexist with violence and cruelty. And it demonstrates that history's greatest transformations often come from the collision of different peoples and belief systems, sometimes resulting in cultural enrichment through exchange, sometimes resulting in suffering and destruction. The Crusades were not simply a grand religious war, nor were they simply economic and political exploitation disguised in religious language. They were both and neither. They were a complex historical phenomenon that revealed much about medieval European civilization, its faith, its ambitions, its capacity for organization, its violent capabilities, and its ability to absorb and learn from other cultures. The Crusades were an attempt by European Christendom to reshape the world according to its vision. That attempt ultimately failed in its primary objective, but not before transforming the Mediterranean world, shaping the course of history, and leaving consequences that echo through the centuries to this very day. Thank you for joining this journey through the history of the Crusades.